Have you ever felt like your personality traits might actually be causing your physical symptoms and chronic pain? That's the theory behind the work of Dr. Gabor Maté and his book, When the Body Says No. Today I'm going to share with you a story from this book about being too good. And if this is something that you feel might be occurring in your life, if you've ever caught yourself people-pleasing or showing perfectionism, it's something to consider when we're looking at the root cause of physical health conditions. This theory of the personality behind the illness, as presented by Gabor Maté and other thought leaders in this field, certainly played a part in my own recovery from decades of chronic illness. And just a trigger warning, Dr. Gabor Maté does go into details of specific health conditions, so if that's not right for you today, perhaps you'd like to skip ahead to a later part of this video. It's titled, The Little Girl Too Good to Be True. You might like to get comfortable now. Perhaps you want to close your eyes or soften your gaze so you can listen. It would be an understatement to say that the spring and summer of 1996 was a stressful time in Natalie's life. In March, her 16-year-old son was discharged from a 6-month stay at a drug rehab centre. He had used drugs and alcohol for the previous 2 years and was repeatedly expelled from school. "We were lucky we got him into the residential treatment programme," says the 53-year-old former nurse. "He had only been home a short while when first my husband was diagnosed and then me." In July, her husband, Bill, underwent surgery for a malignant bowel tumour. After the operation, they were told the cancer had spread to his liver. Natalie had suffered fatigue, dizziness and ringing in her ears from time to time, but her symptoms were of short duration and resolved without treatment. In the year before her diagnosis, she had felt more tired than usual. A bout of vertigo in June led to a CT scan with negative results. 2 months later, an MRI of Natalie's brain showed the characteristic abnormalities associated with multiple sclerosis. Focal areas of inflammation where myelin, the fatty tissue lining nerve cells, was damaged and scarred. Multiple sclerosis, from the Greek meaning to harden, is the most common of the so-called demyelinating diseases that impair the functioning of cells in the central nervous system. Its symptoms depend on where the inflammation and scarring occur. The main areas attacked are usually the spinal cord, the brainstem, and the optic nerve, which is the bundle of nerve fibers carrying visual information to the brain. If the site of damage is somewhere in the spinal cord, the symptoms will be numbness, pain, or unpleasant sensations in the limbs or trunk. There may also be involuntary tightening of the muscles or weakness. In the lower part of the brain, the loss of myelin can induce double vision or problems with speech or balance. Patients with optic neuritis, inflammation of the optic nerve, suffer temporary visual loss. Fatigue is a common symptom, a sense of overwhelming exhaustion far beyond ordinary tiredness. Natalie's dizziness continued through the fall and early winter while she nursed her husband through his convalescence from the bowel operation and a 12-week course of chemotherapy. For a while afterwards, Bill was able to resume work as a real estate agent. Then in May 1997, a second operation was performed to excise the tumours in his liver. Following the resection, in which they removed 75% of his liver, Bill developed a blood clot in his portal vein. He could have died from that, says Natalie. He became very confused and combative. Bill died in 1999, but not before subjecting his wife to more emotional agony than she could have foreseen. Researchers in Colorado looked at 100 people with a type of MS called relapsing remitting, in which flare-ups alternate with symptom-free periods. This is the type Natalie has. Patients burdened by qualitatively extreme stresses, such as major relationship difficulties or financial insecurity, were almost 4 times as likely to suffer exacerbations. I was still having a lot of vertigo over Christmas of 1996, but after that I was almost 100%, Natalie reported. Only my gait was a little off. And despite all my problems with Bill's liver resection, I had to take care of him. I had to take him to the emergency ward 4 times between July and August. I was fine. It appeared Bill was turning around, and we were hopeful that there would be no more complications. Then I had another exacerbation. The flare-up came when Natalie thought she could relax a little, when her services were no longer urgently needed. My husband was the type of person who felt that he shouldn't have to do anything he didn't want to do. He was always like that. When he was sick, he just figured he was definitely not going to do anything. He would sit down on the sofa and snap his fingers. And when he snapped, you jumped. Even the kids were getting very impatient with him. Finally, in the fall, when he was better, I sent him out of town for a few days with some friends. I said, he needs to get out. What did you need? I asked. I was fed up. I said, take him away to play some golf for a few days, and this friend came and picked him up, and 2 hours later, I knew I was having another exacerbation. What might she have learned from this experience? Well, Natalie says, that I need to know when to withdraw my helping mode, but I just can't. If somebody needs help, I have to do it. Regardless of what's happening for you? Yes. 5 years down the road, and I still have not learned that I have to pace myself. My body says no to me frequently, and I keep going. I don't learn. Natalie's body had many reasons to say no throughout her marriage. Bill was a heavy drinker and often embarrassed her. When he would have a bit too much to drink, he became ugly, she says. He would be argumentative, aggressive, lose his temper. We would be out at a party, and if something upset him, he would tear strips off people in public for no reason. I would just turn around and walk away. And then he would be angry at me for not supporting him. I knew within 48 hours of being diagnosed with MS that Bill would not be there for me. Returning from his golfing vacation, Bill experienced some months of physical vigour. He engaged in a relationship with another... This is very hard to read. How are you finding listening to it, guys? I don't like this guy, Bill. Poor Natalie. And Gabor Maté is just reporting a lot of what she says without commenting on it so far. But I'm really wanting to hear from Gabor Maté because it's quite hard to hear from poor Natalie. Okay, I'm carrying on reading. He engaged in a relationship with another woman, a friend of the family. I thought, look, what I've done for you, says Natalie. I've jeopardised my own health. I was there for you all summer. You were at death's door, and I sat for 72 hours in that hospital waiting to see if you were going to die or live. I looked after you when you came home, and this is how I get paid back. I get kicked in the teeth. The idea that psychological stress increases the risk for multiple sclerosis is not new. The French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot was first to give a full clinical description of multiple sclerosis. Patients, he reported in a lecture in 1868, connect long-continued grief or vexation with the onset of symptoms. 5 years later, a British physician described a case also associated with stress. Etiologically, it is important to mention another statement the poor creature made when giving a more confidential account to the nurse, that the cause of her disease was having caught her husband in bed with another woman. For this book, continues Gabor Maté, I interviewed 9 people with MS, 8 of them women. About 60% of those affected are women. The emotional patterns illustrated in Natalie's story are evident in each person, if not always as dramatically. The evidence gathered from my interviews is consistent with the published research. Many students of this disease have voiced the clinical impression that emotional stress may somehow be implicated in the genesis of MS. A research article noted in 1970. Excessive emotional involvement with a parent, a lack of a psychological independence, an overwhelming need for love and affection, and the inability to feel or express anger have long been identified by medical observers as possible factors in the natural development of the disease. A study in 1958 found that in nearly 90% of cases, before the onset of symptoms, patients experienced traumatic life events that had threatened their security system. A study done in 1969 looked at the role of psychological processes in 32 patients from Israel and the United States. 85% of these MS patients experienced the emergence of symptoms that were subsequently diagnosed as multiple sclerosis in the wake of recently highly stressful events. The nature of stressor varied considerably, from the death or illness of loved ones to a sudden threat of loss of livelihood, or perhaps to a family event that caused permanent change in a person's life and demanded a flexibility or adaptation beyond his ability to manage. Protracted marital conflict was one such source of stress, increased responsibility at work another. The common characteristic, write the authors of this study, is the gradual realization of the inability to cope with a difficult situation, provoking feelings of inadequacy or failure. These stresses held across different cultures. Another study compared MS patients with a group of healthy controls. Severely threatening events were 10 times more common, and marital conflict 5 times more frequent in the MS group. Of the 8 women with multiple sclerosis I spoke with, only one was still in her first long-term relationship. The others had separated or divorced. 4 of the women had been abused physically or psychologically by their partners sometime before the onset of the illness. In the remaining cases, their partners had been emotionally distant and unavailable. Lois, a journalist, was 24 when she was diagnosed with MS in 1974. A brief episode of double vision was followed some months later by pins and needles, sensations in her legs. She had lived the previous 2 years in a small native settlement in the Arctic with a man 9 years her senior, an artist whom she now describes as mentally unstable. Later, he was hospitalized for manic depressive illness. I idolized him, she recalls. He was very talented, and I felt I didn't know anything. Maybe I was a little afraid of him. Lois found life in the Arctic extremely difficult. For a sheltered West Coast girl, it was like moving to Timbuktu. I saw a psychologist for years afterwards, and he said, "You were lucky to get out of there alive." There was a lot of drinking, death, murder, isolation. There's no road in there. I was physically afraid of my partner, of his judgment and his anger. It was a summer romance that should have lasted a few months, but it lasted a couple of years. I tried to hang on as hard as I could, but eventually he kicked me out. The living conditions were bad. We had an outhouse, and in 40 or 50 degree weather, that's awful. Then he conceded and got a honey bucket, as they called it, that I could pee into at night, because women have to pee more than men, right? That was a concession, I inquire. Yes, right. We had to cart it away to dump it, and he didn't want to do that. One night, he chucked it out in the snow and told me to use the outhouse. I also had to carry the water. We had no running water. There was no option. If I wanted to stay with him, I had to put up with that. I remember saying the main thing I wanted from him was respect. I don't know why, but that was the big thing for me. I wanted that so badly, I was willing to put up with a lot. Lois says that a desperate need for approval had characterized her earlier life as well, especially her relationship with her mother. I transferred to him, my mother always being in control of my life, telling me what to wear, decorating my room, telling me what I should do from the beginning. I was the little girl, too good to be true. It means that you subjugate your own wants or needs in order to get approval. I was always trying to be who my parents wanted me to be. Okay, so that's Lois's story. I would love to hear what you're thinking about this. Can you relate? She's saying, what I really wanted from this man was respect. And yet he's saying that if she pees in a bucket at night, it's because he's giving her a special kindness. So it seems like she's wanting respect to be shown to her in words, and she's not trusting her judgment at that time in her life to notice whether he's respecting her with his actions. And she's not looking at what her real needs are. Is it too much to ask if you feel that you really need an indoor bathroom? Is it a good idea to stay with a man for years if you feel afraid of him? Of course, I feel that this was part of her journey towards chronic illness. She was acting out patterns of behavior that she had learned very early in her life in order to protect herself, in order to survive through no fault of her own. And also, just to give you a word of hope, if you're listening to these stories from Gabor Maté, so I'd like to share from my own perspective, something which Gabor doesn't put into his books, but I wish he would, that I see recovery stories from conditions like this every day. And I see people who have chronic illness, who've been given terrible diagnoses and terrible prognoses, turn the story around when they start learning how to undo those patterns, change their behaviors, and start reversing what they learned when they were very young. So we can do that through nervous system healing. In case you're new here, my name is Amari Love. I'm a writer, a mind-body practitioner, and a somatic coach who recovered from 3 decades of chronic illness. And now I share everything I learned. I'm going to read to you from a little bit later in the book where Dr. Gabor Maté talks about the reasoning behind this and his view on the medical approach. The medical approach to health and illness continues to suppose that body and mind are separate from each other and from the milieu in which they exist. Compounding that mistake is a definition of stress that is narrow and simplistic. Medical thinking usually sees stress as highly disturbing but isolated events such as, for example, sudden unemployment, a marriage breakup, or the death of a loved one. These major events are potent sources of stress for many, but there are other chronic daily stresses in people's lives that are more insidious and more harmful in their long-term biological consequences. Internally generated stresses take their toll without in any way seeming out of the ordinary. For those habituated to high levels of internal stress since early childhood, it is the absence of stress that creates unease, evoking boredom and a sense of meaninglessness. People may become addicted to their own stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, Hans Selye observed. To such persons, stress feels desirable, while the absence of it feels like something to be avoided. When people describe themselves as being stressed, they usually mean the nervous agitation they experience under excessive demands, most commonly in the areas of work, family, relationships, finances, or health. But sensations of nervous tension do not define stress, nor, strictly speaking, are they always perceived when people are stressed. Stress, as we will define it, is not a matter of subjective feeling. It is a measurable set of objective physiological events in the body involving the brain, the hormonal apparatus, the immune system, and many other organs. Both animals and people can experience stress with no awareness of its presence. Stress is not simply nervous tension, Selye pointed out in his book. Stress reactions do occur in lower animals and even in plants. Stress can be produced under deep anesthesia in patients who are unconscious, and even in cell cultures grown outside the body. Similarly, stress effects can be highly active in persons who are fully awake but who are in the grip of unconscious emotions or cut off from their body responses. The physiology of stress may be triggered without observable effects on behavior and without subjective awareness, as has been shown in animal experiments and in human studies. What then is stress? Selye, who coined the word in its present usage and who described with mock pride how der Stress, le stress, and lo stress entered German, French, and Italian languages, respectively, conceived of stress as a biological process, a wide-ranging set of events in the body, irrespective of cause or subjective awareness. Stress consists of the internal alterations, visible or not, that occur when the organism perceives a threat to its existence or well-being. While nervous tension may be a component of stress, one can be stressed without feeling tension. On the other hand, it is possible to feel tension without activating the physiological mechanisms of stress. In searching for a word to capture the meaning of the physical changes he observed in his experiments, Selye stumbled upon the term stress, which had long been used in common English and particularly in engineering to denote the effects of a force acting against a resistance. He gives the example of changes induced in a stretched rubber band or in a steel spring under pressure. So Gabor Maté is referring to this wonderful work by Hans Selye. Let me check the name of the book, called The Stress of Life. And in that book, it's very interesting because this is where the term stress was actually coined for the way that we use it currently. And what Dr. Gabor Maté is saying in this book is that what we're calling stress, a feeling of agitation, or, when you're out of breath, your heart rate goes up, you're noticeably in a state of exhilaration or nervousness. He's saying that's not stress. Stress can be completely unnoticeable. What stress is when the nervous system perceives threat and it goes into certain physiological actions. It does change things inside the body's cells. But we might not be aware of that. We might not be aware that the whole system has gone into that danger response. This is what he's saying. This is what he's saying we need to use the word stress to mean. So I notice this often when I'm guiding people and they'll come to work with me and they'll say things like, oh, but I mustn't get nervous about going on holiday, right? Or I mustn't get nervous that my boss is coming into work tomorrow and checking what I'm doing, because they're saying I mustn't get stressed, right? Because they're worried that stress is going to make their symptoms get worse. But that nervousness, that agitation, that heightened sense of exhilaration or faster heart rate is not the stress that is causing the symptoms. This is what Gabor Maté is explaining here by referring to the work of Dr. Hans Selye. This theory about stress is very interesting, and the word is so widely misused that a lot of people have a lot of fear about symptoms that they don't need to have. You don't need to stay calm all the time. You're not trying to avoid getting worked up. In fact, it's that long-term, daily, chronic stress that's wearing on you, that's hidden from awareness, that needs to be resolved. I would love to hear your thoughts on what I'm reading. I would love to hear from you, whether you have any kind of chronic condition or not, or anything that might be being driven by hidden stressors, by personality traits. Is this something you've ever considered as a possible root cause to what you're suffering? If this work has resonated with you today, I'm going to link for you to another practice on screen to help you with your nervous system healing today. Thank you for being here. It means a lot. Take good care of yourself now.